The squirrel sitting on your fence right now, the one you've been feeding peanuts to every morning before your coffee even finishes brewing, might be quietly starving in front of you while looking perfectly plump. That roundness you've been proud of, the one that makes you think you're doing a good job, could actually be one of the clearest warning signs that something in his diet is breaking down his body from the inside. Welcome back to NutriPause, where we take the food, health, and everyday care of the squirrels in your yard seriously, because they deserve more than guesswork. Today we're walking through 7 foods people hand feed to backyard squirrels almost every single day, thinking it's kindness, when it's actually setting off a slow chain of damage. Most people never connect to the animal's decline. And stick around for number 4, because it's the one almost nobody suspects, sitting right there in your kitchen pantry, disguised as a treat. There's also something waiting at the very end that isn't on any list, something most feeders never get warned about until it's too late. And by the time we get there, you'll understand exactly why so many well-fed squirrels don't live nearly as long as they should. The first food most people don't think twice about is peanuts, the classic, the one everyone associates with squirrels, the one sold in bulk bags at almost every hardware store with a cartoon squirrel on the packaging. Here's what that packaging doesn't tell you. Peanuts are extremely high in phosphorus and very low in calcium, and squirrels, like a lot of small mammals, need a careful calcium to phosphorus balance to keep their bones strong. Wildlife rehabilitators who treat injured and orphaned squirrels regularly report a condition called metabolic bone disease in squirrels that have been fed a peanut-heavy diet for extended periods, where the body actually starts pulling calcium out of the bones to try to correct the imbalance in the bloodstream. Over time, this leaves the skeleton weaker, more prone to fractures from falls that a healthy squirrel would shrug off without issue. Try this tomorrow. Instead of a handful of peanuts, put out a small dish with a few unsalted peanuts mixed with a spoonful of dried mealworms or a bit of boiled egg, something with a better balance, and watch how quickly the squirrel notices the variety and goes for it just as eagerly. It's a small swap that costs you nothing extra, and it starts correcting a problem you didn't know you were creating. What feels like generosity through peanuts is, quietly and slowly, thinning out the very frame that squirrel needs to survive its next hard winter. The second food is bread, and this one might be the most common mistake in every park, every backyard, every well-meaning grandparent tossing crusts off the porch. Bread fills a squirrel's stomach without giving its body almost anything it actually needs. No real protein, minimal fat content, barely any of the vitamins or minerals a squirrel's metabolism depends on. Wildlife nutrition guidance from rehabilitation centers across the country consistently list bread as one of the top things to avoid feeding backyard wildlife, precisely because an animal that fills up on empty calories stops seeking out the natural, nutrient-dense foods in your yard, like acorns, hickory nuts, and native seeds, because it's not hungry enough to go looking. Try this tomorrow. If you've been tossing bread, stop for 1 week and replace it with a small scattering of raw, unsalted sunflower seeds, or a few chunks of fresh apple, and pay attention to whether the squirrel seems more active, more engaged with actual foraging behavior around your yard, instead of just waiting by the porch. A squirrel that's full on bread is a squirrel that's slowly forgetting how to feed itself. The third food is anything salted, and this one sneaks in constantly because it's often the same nuts people already have in the pantry for themselves: roasted and salted cashews, salted peanuts, salted sunflower seeds, the kind sold for human snacking. A squirrel's kidneys are simply not built to process the sodium levels found in salted human snack food, and consistent exposure puts real strain on those small organs over time, leading to dehydration and, in more serious cases documented by wildlife rehabilitators, kidney stress that shortens an animal's lifespan without any single dramatic moment where you'd notice something was wrong. Try this tomorrow. Check whatever container you've been feeding from, and if it says salted or roasted with salt, swap it out this week for the raw, unsalted version, which costs about the same and is sitting on the same store shelf. It feels like such a small detail to worry about, and that's exactly why it's so dangerous, because nothing about a salted cashew looks harmful in your hand. The fourth food, the one almost nobody suspects, is dried corn, the cheap yellow kernels sold in giant bags specifically marketed for squirrels and backyard wildlife feeding. It looks natural. It looks like something a squirrel would eat, and squirrels do eat corn happily, sometimes too happily, because dried corn is calorie-dense with very little of the fat and protein content that wild forage foods like nuts and fungi provide. Squirrels that fill up primarily on dried corn from a feeder often show the same body condition issues rehabilitators associate with malnutrition despite looking outwardly heavy, because the weight gain is often more water retention and poor quality fat than the lean muscle and healthy fat reserves a squirrel actually needs to survive cold months. There's also a mold risk. Dried corn left out in humid or wet conditions develops mycotoxins that are genuinely toxic to small mammals. And this is one of the more overlooked hazards flagged by wildlife rehabilitation organizations dealing with backyard feeding stations. Try this tomorrow. If corn is a big part of what you put out, cut the quantity by half and add in a small handful of walnuts or pecans in the shell instead. And check your feeder daily for any dried corn that's gotten wet or developed a musty smell, tossing it immediately rather than letting the squirrel find it first. We're only halfway through, and what's coming in signs 5 and 6 involves two foods that seem almost impossible to associate with harm. One of them fruit-based, and one of them something people specifically buy labeled as squirrel food. So stay with me here, because this is where most feeders get genuinely surprised. The fifth food is grapes and raisins, which feels almost cruel to include because they seem like such a wholesome, fruity option, and squirrels do love them. The issue is less understood in squirrels specifically compared to dogs, where grape toxicity is well documented and severe, but wildlife veterinarians and rehabilitators have grown increasingly cautious about offering grapes and raisins to small mammals generally, given how concentrated the sugar content is in raisins especially, and how quickly that sugar spike can affect an animal with a body as small as a squirrel's. Beyond the sugar concern, raisins are sticky and small enough to pose a genuine choking risk when a squirrel tries to cram several into its cheek pouches at once, something rehabilitators see far more often than people expect. Try this tomorrow. If you've been offering grapes or raisins, switch to a small piece of fresh strawberry or a slice of blueberry instead, giving the same sweet appeal with a fraction of the concentrated sugar and none of the sticky choking risk. It's the kind of food that looks like a treat and behaves in the body more like a small daily assault on the pancreas. The sixth food is anything from a commercial birdseed mix that contains a heavy ratio of milo, wheat, or filler grains, the cheap blends sold in massive bags at big box stores. Squirrels will absolutely eat from these mixes when they raid a bird feeder, and many backyard feeders assume that's fine because it's marketed as wildlife food generally. The problem is that low-quality filler grains offer minimal nutritional density for a squirrel's specific needs, and squirrels that rely heavily on raided birdseed as a primary food source often show poorer coat condition and slower recovery from minor injuries, something wildlife rehabilitators frequently note when squirrels come in from yards with unsecured feeders. Try this tomorrow. If your squirrel is mostly living off spillover from your bird feeder, consider adding a small dedicated squirrel feeding station nearby, stocked with actual nuts in the shell, which redirects that energy toward food that actually nourishes rather than just fills. What looks like sharing is often just letting a squirrel survive on scraps designed for a completely different animal. The seventh food, and one of the most surprising, is anything containing chocolate or caffeine, which sounds obvious until you realize how often trail mix, granola bars, or leftover baked goods get tossed out as an easy way to get rid of kitchen scraps. Chocolate contains theobromine, a compound that is genuinely toxic to most small mammals, including squirrels, affecting the heart and nervous system even in small amounts relative to body size. And this is one of the clearest, most consistent warnings issued by wildlife veterinarians regarding any small backyard mammal. Try this tomorrow. Go through whatever you've been tossing out as leftover scraps this week, and specifically check ingredient labels for chocolate, cocoa, or caffeine before it goes anywhere near your feeding area. And if you're unsure, don't put it out at all. A squirrel doesn't know the difference between a treat and a threat. It just knows something smells good, and that trust is exactly what makes this one so dangerous. And then there's the eighth thing, the one that isn't really a food at all, but might be doing more damage than any single item on this list. And it's simply feeding too much, too consistently, at the same time every single day. This is the quiet one. This is the one that doesn't show up as a dramatic illness or an obvious injury. And it's the one that connects directly to why so many people who love the squirrels in their yard, who look forward to that visit every morning, who feel a real and genuine bond with an animal that technically owes them nothing, end up watching that same squirrel struggle later in life without understanding why. When a squirrel becomes dependent on a reliable daily feeding from you, its natural foraging and caching behavior, the instinct that would normally have it burying dozens of nuts across your yard and neighboring yards to survive winter, weakens. Wildlife rehabilitators who study release readiness in squirrels consistently point to over-reliance on human feeding as one of the biggest obstacles to an animal's long-term survival. Because if anything happens to that reliable food source, whether you move, whether you simply forget for a week, whether life gets busy, that squirrel hasn't kept its natural survival skills sharp enough to fully compensate. For anyone reading this who feeds a squirrel because it's one of the only consistent living things they see each day, because a spouse passed, because the kids moved out, because the house got quiet in a way that wasn't planned, this isn't about taking that connection away from you. It's about understanding that real care sometimes means feeding a little less predictably, mixing in natural foraging opportunities, letting that squirrel keep the instincts that will actually keep it alive long after your relationship with it began. What that squirrel's visits mean, at the most grounded and scientific level, is a relationship built on trust and reliability that only stays healthy for both of you if the animal never fully forgets how to survive without you. So here's what I want to know from you, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. What's one food you've been feeding your backyard squirrel that you just found out on this list? And are you going to swap it out starting tomorrow? Drop in the comments because I read every single one and I want to hear what surprised you the most. If this shifted even one thing about how you feed the squirrel in your yard, send it to someone else who feeds theirs too, because chances are they're making at least one of these same mistakes without knowing it. This has been NutriPause, and I'll see you in the next one.